Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, here's your host, Jason Day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Day, and I had an amazing conversation about church revitalization with Daniel M. Daniel is the director of church multiplication at ChurchLeaders.com and Lifeway Christian Resources. He serves as a teaching pastor at The Fellowship, a multi-site church in Nashville, Tennessee. Daniel trains and equips ministry leaders around the world, sharing practical and biblical advice in a variety of ways, including via podcasts that he co-hosts, like the New Church's Q&A podcast, 5 Leadership Questions, and his newest podcast, In Between, which he hosts with his lovely wife, Christina. Daniel's latest book is entitled No Silver Bullets, 5 Small Shifts That Will Transform Your Ministry. Now, in this week's episode, Daniel and I have a great conversation. We discuss how ministry leaders can avoid the biggest mistake that churches make when approaching revitalization. Daniel provides helpful questions that you can lead your ministry team through to refine your revitalization efforts. We also share why making the distinction between discipleship as destination and discipleship as direction is so vital to helping your church make a bigger impact for the kingdom. Now, this is one of those episodes that you'll want to share with your ministry leaders, so be sure to pass this one along. Let's jump into my conversation with Daniel M. Daniel, welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I am so excited that you could be with us, brother.
Man, it's so good to be with you, Jason.
Awesome. Now, Daniel, you've been blessed. You have, for those who do not know you, you have quite an interesting ministry background. You've been involved.
One way to put it.
Yeah, in a variety of church experiences and ministry leadership roles, literally internationally. Canada, Korea, and here in the U.S. And you're a teaching pastor now. You're involved in ministry through Lifeway Leadership and ChurchLeaders.com. You travel literally the world, helping train and equip pastors and ministry leaders. So super excited to have you with us. And I know that we've talked about this. One of the priorities that both of us see as we travel, as we coach and help equip churches, is that pastors and churches are really focusing in on revitalization.
Yeah, for sure.
Really kind of, pastors are recognizing the need to focus on becoming an influence for Christ and for the kingdom in their communities, making this spiritual and eternal impact, right? And this
Completely.
is just something that we see. And pastors tend to be very passionate about this. And I'm sure that many who are listening in today, pastors and ministry leaders, are reflecting on their own ministry, their own church, and their own communities, right? And thinking through, Lord, how do we make an impact for the kingdom? And so for myself, speaking as someone who has been in ministry leadership for over 20 years, the majority of that time as a lead pastor, I personally know, you know this as well as a pastor, that kind of the urgency, the sincere passion to see your local church, those people God has entrusted to you, that community to which God has called you, to really see it revitalized, to see it making a difference and making an impact for Christ. So,
100%.
So I think the first question, we understand this is a reality. And so the first question I have for you, Daniel, is, through your experiences, through working with churches of all different contexts, right? What do you see as really the biggest mistake, perhaps we could frame it this way, the biggest mistake that pastors, ministry leaders, churches are making as they're stepping into this revitalization effort?
Yeah. The thing that I see most often is everyone wants the quick fix. Right? We're addicted to the instant. You want a book? Download it on Kindle, right? Podcast, stream it on the way to work or whatnot. So we're always wanting everything right away. And if things don't deliver the results right away, immediately, we think, oh, maybe we did it wrong, or maybe we need to go find something else. So they're looking for that shortcut or that silver bullet. So a lot of churches are going to, the thing that they do most is they'll just go and copy what that successful church down the road does.
Right.
Right. So, Jason, you and I mean, on our podcasts, on the Church Leaders one that you host and on the ones that I host, I mean, we interview great ministry leaders. And in the course of the interview, they're going to share ideas, stories. We hear this in conferences. We read this in books. And there's usually something that they say they're like, oh, I got to do that.
Yeah.
Right. So they take that idea that has been built around a particular context that has been created to meet a specific need, and we kind of take that out, kind of like we're doing an organ transplant, and we just stick it in, we stick it into our context, and we wonder why the organ doesn't last. We wonder why the church or the body rejects the transplant because we haven't looked at, what is the blood type? How, is it a match? And is there, there's so many different circumstances that we just don't take into consideration because we're enamored by the great idea and we just try to copy it into our context.
Yeah, that's so good. I love the imagery too because it's so dead on, and we see that. So one of the things that I think is a challenge for us as pastors and ministry leaders is that this passion to make an impact can be so strong that, like you said, we rush into attempts at pulling together a bunch of different things, whether it's something we've heard, we've read, we've seen, other churches engaged in, as you've said, and this tends to be a reality for so many pastors, because there's a sense of urgency. Yeah. We're like, hey, this is, we need to make an impact for Christ. This is our calling.
It's not just for fun,
right? Exactly.
For change's sake, yeah.
So how do you balance this sense of urgency, right, that we just naturally have as those who are called on mission, right? Which God has called all of us to participate in His mission, as crazy as that sounds, and He's entrusted us with this, right? So how do you balance that urgency to make a difference, to make an impact, with not just kind of running after, whatever the latest thing is that you happen to hear or read?
Yeah, completely. It's kind of like when I think back to when I was 16, and on my birthday, I went to go do the driver's test, the knowledge test. I'd been studying all the way up till that point, and the day I was allowed to go and do the road test, I did it. And I remember after doing that, that's how excited I was about driving, right? But I remember after doing that written test, and I got my permit, and I got into the car the first time with my dad, and he was like, okay, let's go. I was like, this is going to be so easy. I had been playing the driving racing games, the ones
exactly.
in the arcades with the real wheels. I wasn't doing automatic, man. I was using manual with the clutch.
Yeah.
Right. And everywhere we went, like I was saying, like I knew everything about driving, but when I stepped into the seat, I didn't know a thing about, I didn't know how to drive. I knew everything about driving, but I didn't know how to drive. And a lot of times in ministry, and I was really passionate about driving. Well, a lot of times in ministry, we know so much because we love learning about the other or about what's going on. And that's the thing. I love how Sun Tzu, the guy who wrote The Art of War, put it. It's a paraphrase. He said, if you know your enemy, you'll win half the battles. But if you know yourself, you'll win the other half. And I'm not about to say, I'm not about to pit the church down the road as the enemy.
Right.
However, a lot of times we spend as ministry leaders so much time learning about the other that we don't actually know about ourselves.
That's good.
We don't know why we lead the way we lead. We don't know how we lead the way we lead. We don't know any of that. As a result, when we try to start something new or import an idea, that's why oftentimes it's met with rejection, because we don't know the particular context in which we are serving. Not only our context here, right? Not only our local church context, but who we are as leaders. So that's why when you think about that, in my book, No Silver Bullets, I talk about these 4 different types of churches: the copycat church, the silver bullet church, the hippie church, the intentional church. And I have assessments to help you figure out what you are, because honestly, if we were just to take even, maybe the same amount of time, but even if not the same amount of time, just like a quarter of the time that we spend reading other people's stuff and learning about other people's context, if we just spend a quarter of that time just learning about how God has created us and what's happened in the unique context of our church and ministry, we're going to be much better and much further down the road than trying to import any idea.
Yeah. And I've across my ministry, I've seen that to be so true. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, and I almost hate to say this because of the reality of it, but when you're young in ministry, it's kind of like you're saying you first get your driver's license, right? Yeah. You're like ready to take on the world. And I love that. I love that kind of even about me and about young pastors and church planners that have the opportunity to mentor and coach and stuff. I love that about it. But there are certain things that I look back and reflect on my ministry journey, and I'm thankful for God's grace, because there are lots of times where I was just like, hey, let's get this done. Let's go after this. I mean, this is the kingdom, this is, and so you kind of are rushing into things, but it took me time to learn, like, hold up. We need to figure out who we are and where we are before we can even figure out what's next, right? If you don't even know really where you are, it's really hard to determine what your next step is.
Yeah. So here's a really easy example, right? Here's a great question. Who do you look up to as a pastor and a church leader? Right? So I mean, even if I look at the recent guests that you've had on the podcast, right? Robbie Gallaty, Kara Powell, Ken Costa, Drew Dick, Erwin McManus. You look at all of these people, these great leaders that you've had on. We usually have, if someone were to grab your phone and look through your podcasts, you could probably begin forming an idea around how this person preaches, right, and how this person's theology is shaped and how it is based on who they look up to. Right. So I think the first question for every one of your listeners is, who do you look up to? Right. Is it Eugene Peterson, J.I. Packer, Tim Keller? I mean, who is it? Because the ones you follow are the ones you model. Because once you determine that, you can then go down the route of, okay, yes, here are all the people that I look up to. Right. Now, how have they shaped me? Right. So, for example, I love how you've had Erwin McManus on, right? I mean, he is such a creative thinker and one of the best storytellers that I've ever heard.
Right.
So when I listen to him preach, I'm listening specifically for the way that he engages and the way that he tells stories. Right. And then when I listen to Tim Keller, I'm listening to particularly the way that he exegetes a particular passage. When I listen to, right. So every single person that we listen to, there are things that it's not just that you're going to fully accept everything that person is.
Right.
Right. Because then, I mean, that's not God has only created one Jason Day, right? Well, God has only created one Daniel and one any of these other people, but it's first digging into that before we can then actually forge a pathway forward.
That's good. Now, Daniel, in No Silver Bullets, your book, which is absolutely fantastic. If you guys haven't read it and you're in ministry at all, I encourage you to pick up a copy. So because it's so practical. I mean, it just walks you through so much, so helpful. And a lot of what you focus on is this idea of self-assessment and self-awareness, right? And so, but we have kind of two pieces to that, Daniel, right? And I hear you talking about this. So we have the self-awareness for us as the ministry leader, the pastor. And then we also have this kind of self-awareness for the church, the ministry that we're leading. So what are some practical ways we can approach? Obviously, you just gave a great example of trying to help understand ourselves as a ministry leader, as a pastor, and there are plenty of other things. I know, for example, Strengths Finders. I know you're a certified Strengths Finder coach or consultant or whatever, and so that's a great tool that I always took my staff through. Staff pastors through to have the opportunity to kind of get to know them. It's kind of some additional self-awareness things. The Enneagram is huge right now. I mean, there are different ways for us to learn more about ourselves, which I think, and you've said very clearly, that is something that you never stop learning about is yourself. Yes. And that's key if we're going to lead for impact and influence, within the church. But so there's that personal self-awareness. What about the self-awareness that we need to kind of walk through as a church? Yeah, and let me throw out two things, Daniel, to you first. Sure. One, if we can talk about in two ways, because I'm sure, and we've all been in this position in some way, most of us who are in ministry leadership, there's some who are new to a new ministry assignment, a new church. So they really don't have any background, or not much of background or context. All they have is what the team told them as they were interviewing them, and
all of it.
Exactly, which we know what that's like, right? So so we have that, but then also we have lots of pastors and ministry leaders who've been in a church for multiple years, and they've been faithfully serving week in, week out, and yet they feel God calling them. They know there's a deeper work God wants to do in their church and through their church to their community, right? So let's talk about self-awareness, and if we can, talk a little bit about, and maybe some of the things cross over, right? And if they do, just walk us through that. But those kind of two different scenarios, one, a newer church setting, but the other one is, man, we've been here, we've been faithfully serving, but we know there's something deeper that God wants to do. So
that's really good. So when you think about those two contexts, right? And earlier on, you were talking about churches that are wanting to revitalize, and I think this applies also for new church plants as well. Because here's the thing: I mean, a lot of times you think, the context of the church, the history of the church, the culture of the church. If I just plant a new church, then I don't need to worry about any of that, right? Well. Wrong.
Right. Yep.
And here's the thing: it's because everyone, in a revitalizing context, everyone that is at your church, obviously there have been previous pastors, right? And it's not only just about who has been pastors and what's the culture of that church, but it's the entire region as well. But in a new church plant, everyone is still coming with that same thing. It's just not all the same,
right?
So it's different. So the question that I would always ask, especially if you're if you're going into a brand new context, if you're interviewing at a church or you're about to start in a new assignment, and this can be you are going into a church or you're changing roles within the church. I would always start with a season of listening where you ask people, what do you hope never changes? Because when you ask them the question, what do you hope never changes? What you're going to get is you're asking a question on the side. So a lot of times if you ask straightforward questions about, hey, what do you think would be successful for me to do here? Or what did the person do bad? Or you're going to get the answer that they have been thinking about that is on the top of their head. But if you get at it from the side, if you kind of flank them, right? Right? And you say, hey, what do you hope never changes? Then you're actually going to get into the nostalgia part, and you're going to get into what they truly value.
That's good.
So ask that question. Ask it to as many people as you can, but also consider the geographical context of the church and how that might affect the way that you do ministry and programming. So for example, I am pro multi-site and I'm pro church planting, right? Both. And I think a lot of churches can do both and there are a lot of multi-site churches that shouldn't be doing multi-site, but they just got into it because it was the thing to do. And they didn't want to build a bigger building or they didn't want to move this or that. And they're kind of struggling. There's a lot of multi-site churches at 2 campuses and they're like, I don't really know what we're doing. And it's a constant fight. So there's that whole side of the conversation we can get into, right? So you got multi-site and you got church plants. Now, the reason I bring this all up is consider Seattle, for example. There's nothing wrong with multi-site as a strategy to reach the lost. But a multi-site video venue model in Seattle is probably not something that I would encourage a church to do if they are trying to get into multi-site in Seattle.
Specifically because of the context of...
Yeah, specifically because of what happened with Mars Hill there.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with multi-site. I'm pro multi-site and I'm pro live teaching and video. I mean, I've been a part of both.
Right.
But for the next 10, 20 years, I just would not advise that as a strategy, particularly there, if you aren't already doing it, like as a new strategy. Right. So there's this context where, that is completely fine to work elsewhere. And that's where you really have to have that listening posture for those who are in your church, but also be a student of what are the other churches doing in the context and what you can learn from that there.
That's good. So let's take it one step further. So we're looking at getting feedback from whether if it's a new plant, core team members, or getting feedback from if it's existing church, people who are part of that church. We're looking at the context, what other churches have done or are doing in that particular region, that particular area. What about the next step, kind of getting some, handles on the context of life in that city, in that area, outside of church, like just what the culture is for the city as a whole, right?
Yeah, definitely. Take public transit if the city has public transit.
Yeah.
All right, walk the city. And sometimes if you're in a rural area, that you can't do that because there is no public transit. Right. Yeah, and you won't be able to do that. But I would try to do that. I would try to find the watering holes of the city, and I would listen. I would really take that posture of listening. The smaller the city is, I found, the longer it's going to take for you to gain influence and trust with the leaders there. Right? One of my friends, one time he was in seminary, and he was telling me that he was preaching he was pastoring at this church during his seminary years, and he was introducing himself. He saw one of his congregants in a cafe. And his one of the congregants was meeting with his friend, and the congregant introduced him as, "Hey, this is my preacher," to his friend. Right, "This is my preacher." And then afterwards, my friend was kind of like, "Oh, that's kind of weird." He didn't bring it up there. And later on, he talked to me. He's like, "Oh, why did you introduce me as your preacher? I'm your pastor." And he's like, "No, you're not my pastor. You're my preacher because you've only been here for a little bit. You're my pastor when you've been here for so long." And I've done work with rural context and rural churches, and typically in a rural context, it's about 7 years ish that it takes for the church and for the city to see you as their pastor and to see you as someone who's going to stay.
Wow.
Right. So So depending on your context, it's going to flip, right? Versus an urban context that's highly transient. It's obviously not going to take 7 years because most of the people aren't around for 7 years. Yeah. Right.
That's interesting. So, and you write and talk a lot about this idea of understanding not only the self-awareness, but then the fact that is this kind of movement, this direction that the church is moving in. Yeah. And you're inviting people on this journey. So talk to us a little bit about, because I know that kind of the discipleship process is huge part of your ministry, your coaching, your training, and you walk this out through the book No Silver Bullets. But talk to me a little bit about how that plays in. So we have the self-awareness piece is highly important. How does the idea of this kind of discipleship journey fit into revitalization? And let me say something real fast, because oftentimes when we're looking at revitalization, we think of two things. We need to grow deeper spiritually, yes, and we also need to grow, bigger as far as influence in the community, reaching new people who do not yet know Jesus, which, it's hard to argue either of those things, right? Those are both very important. Jesus made that clear. So, and some people will focus maybe more on one and the other, but you talk to us about how these things kind of come together. You write about how these things come together. So help us understand, after the self-awareness piece, where do you recommend pastors, ministry leaders who are looking to revitalize, where do they begin to move next after this just reflection and assessment? Yeah. So I'll say a statement, but the thing that I need to preface this statement first with is the idea that we often teach the way that we've been taught. Okay. So that's not the statement, but that's what I need to preface it with. So we are especially in the West, we are a result of our Western educational system, which you have to put your time in, you get your certificate, you get your degree, you get your credit hours, and then you're good to go. Right? That's just, it's not neither right nor wrong. It's just what it is today. As a result, this is actually seeped into the way that a lot of church leaders view discipleship. They view discipleship as about getting to a destination, right? It's all about putting your time in, getting your credit hours, doing your study, for your church members, completing the classes, getting the check marks, and then getting down the road. And then now that they've done all these classes and met all these requirements and checked off all these things, now they can lead and now they can do this because they're obviously mature. Because look at their transcript, right? You wouldn't call it a transcript to the church, but that's essentially a lot of times what we do. Now, the issue with that, right? The issue is, now when I explain it like that, most pastors are like, no, we don't do it like that. That sounds horrible.
right? And 99% of the time, this is the reaction. It's like, yeah, when I say it like that, obviously that's not how we want it to be, but sadly, that's what we do. So a lot of churches will see discipleship as a program. They'll see it as a program. Whereas in reality, when you look at the scriptures, discipleship is actually more about the direction you're moving in rather than the destination that you've arrived. So it's the direction you're moving in. And we see that biblically, right? We see it from running the race of faith with perseverance. I mean, you see it in so many different passages. So here's a biblical example that I love using. And I just feel like it completely clarifies the difference between discipleship as destination and discipleship as direction. Right. So compare a Pharisee with the Samaritan woman at the well. So the Pharisee, a lot of times we give Pharisees bad raps because we see them as hypocrites. We see them as fully grown hypocrites, and they killed Jesus. So obviously we would see them in a negative lens. But think about it. When that Pharisee was a little kid, I'm sure they weren't like that. I'm sure as they were chosen by the rabbi, right? They had studied the Pentateuch, and they were like, okay, well, I was chosen. Now I got to study the Torah, and I'm gonna learn. I'm gonna memorize. I'm gonna follow the ways of the rabbi. I was chosen to do this, not the family trade. And I'm sure there's just this whole point where they were learning, checking things off, growing, but maybe it was when they were like preteens, where they started getting a little cynical.
Yeah,
they're like, oh, I don't know about this, and they're just going through the motions, right? Not to say that Samuel's sons, were Pharisees, but I mean, you see not Samuel, Eli's sons, Eli, right? You see how they kind of took that all for advantage as priests. So you kind of see that, right? But here's the thing: a lot of times we forget that Pharisees probably were sincere about their faith at some point, and as they got closer to God, at some point they probably turned their backs on him. They changed the direction. So maybe they were really close to God, but and they knew a lot about God, but they didn't know God. Versus the Samaritan woman at the well, right? Imagine her; she's probably as far away from God, especially compared to that Pharisee. She is super far away, and she is not even pointing in the direction of God. Yet when she met Jesus, everything changed, and her direction changed. And instead of pointing away from God, she pointed to him. Even though she didn't know much about God, she knew him. Now compare the two. The Pharisee is super close to God, but pointing the other direction. And the Samaritan woman is super far away from God, but pointing in the right direction. Who would you rather have in your church?
Yeah.
So when you think about it from that perspective, and you compare the difference between a destination approach to discipleship versus a directional approach to discipleship, I mean, especially when I explain it like that, in light of what I said earlier, every pastor listening is going to be like, yeah, of course I want discipleship to be directional. Of course, that's the biblical way to do it. Of course, I don't want it to be destination, but how?
Right.
Because we're byproducts of our Western educational system. So that's the big tension that I wrestle with.
Yeah, that's good. So as we're looking at this shift from discipleship as destination to shifting to discipleship as direction.
Yeah.
And we're thinking, the big picture, what we've been talking about during this conversation is revitalizing our churches to have a bigger impact for the kingdom. How do you, practically speaking, how do you make that shift? And I guess we could say, if you're planting a church, you might have a little bit of advantage there because you can kind of start off laying things out, kind of directionally. But let's think of, many of our pastors are leading churches that are established. So how do you begin to make this shift from destination to direction when it comes to disciple making?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I mean, practically speaking, I would say take everything that you're doing in your church that you would say is there because you're wanting to grow people to become more like Christ, right? Everything that you're doing that's discipleship related, I just throw it all on a whiteboard, and I'd have 3 categories. Which of these are first steps? Which of these are next steps? And which of these are ongoing steps? And the reason I would ask you to start there is because when you look at everything on the board, and this is the whole thing about us copying models and ideas and all that stuff, a lot of church leaders are great at starting things, but we're horrible at stopping them. So the older the church gets, the more established it becomes. There's just a lot of stuff that happens in the church.
Right.
Especially when you have your own building, right? And it's like, got to keep the building full, got to keep it, per use cost. And, you're just going to go all the way down that road. And it's like, so I would just throw it all on the board together. Don't do it by yourself. Do it with your team, whether it's paid staff team or a volunteer team, and just take it all in, and take a big breath. Right. And then grab a red Sharpie. No, I'm just kidding. Don't kill everything, because you'll probably lose your job if you start destroying and knocking off all your ministry areas. Rather, take the categories of first step and ongoing, first, next, and ongoing, and ask yourself the question. Ask yourself as a team this question. Which of these things are so critical to becoming like Jesus, to the discipleship process, that they are ongoing, that they never stop? Right? What are the things that you never grow out of? And these ongoing steps are something that a brand new Christian should be doing or should be learning how to do. And also someone who's been a Christian for 60 years, right? Or regardless of elder, deacon, pastor, just everyone. These are the ongoing steps, the ongoing things that never end on this side of eternity. Once you clarify those things, and an example is reading the Bible.
Right.
Reading the Bible is something no one should ever grow out of, right? Worshiping with others on the weekend, or worshiping with others on a regular basis, corporate worship. It's one of those things that's just look through the book of Acts,
right?
Regardless of whether you're like organic church, house church, mega church, it doesn't matter. Corporate worship is critical to the development of a believer and the formation of a believer, right? So you have these ongoing things that just you never grow out of. Once you identify those things, then figure out, okay, if those are the things that are so important, which of everything else that we do are first steps? The things that not everyone should be doing. And if you've been coming to the church for 50 years or 15 years or 15 months, you shouldn't be doing these, because these are really only for brand new people to the church or brand new believers. What are those first steps? And then everything else, are these all legitimate next steps where someone is doing, they're doing these ongoing steps of being a follower of Christ and growing as a believer, and then they're going to jump into one of these next steps, kind of an on-ramp, and then after they do this next step, they then off-ramp back into the ongoing. Right? When you look at everything you do from the first, next, and ongoing steps framework, and this is super critical to understand, everything in the first and the next steps categories are temporary. They're short-term. A lot of churches that move down the copycat route, first, next, ongoing, they don't have those categories, and nothing's short-term, nothing, and maybe some things are short-term, but there's no definition around what's short-term and what's long-term. As a result, highly programmatic churches, right, copycat or silver bullet churches, as I'll illustrate in the book, they're going to be highly programized because all of these things that should be short-term next step experiences, people just hop from one next step to the next. Oh, I've done that program. Let's do this one. Oh, I've done that one. Now I'm going to do this one. Oh, I'm done that. And they just go to all of these next steps, and they gather this entire list of, look at all that I've done, completed. Shouldn't I be mature? When maybe they're actually not practicing the very things, the ongoing steps that's going to grow them and help them become self-feeders.
That's
good.
So
Christians who live in the next step world, they're consumers. They're consumers because the entire point of the next step is to give you an experience. It's a conference, right? It's a deeper study. It's this or that. And it's all about teaching you. I am teaching you. I'm getting, I've prepared this material that I'm going to help you with. That's the whole point of the next step experience. But if you live there, you never learn how to grab a spoon and feed yourself because someone else is feeding you the entire time.
Wow, that's gold, bro. That's very good, very good. Yeah. So the ongoing, you gave some great examples of ongoing. For the next steps, you just kind of touched on maybe a couple, maybe it's a deeper Bible study or whatever. So I envision oftentimes we'll see these big menus of all these different classes or all these different courses that you can dive into. So why don't you, for our listeners, give a couple examples of some next step things and some first step things as well?
Sure. Okay. So next steps, think 3Ds: discover, deepen, and deploy. Those are really the three categories of next steps. So anything that's a discover next step, so they're kind of subcategories within the next steps. Discover is all about, hey, what kind of classes or events do you have, or seminars, or anything like that, or studies? What do you have for individuals curious about Christianity? Right. So Alpha is a great example.
Yeah.
Right. That would be a great discover next step. A deepen next step would be a class, a seminar, a conference, anything that has a clear start and end date, right? All of these have clear start and end dates, but the focus is on deepening your faith, right? So, for example, when it was Reformation, big Reformation year, a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, and everyone was studying about the Reformation. I mean, maybe you never talked about this.
Yeah.
Right. But that year that would be a great year, whether you are Lutheran or, whatever, whether you like Martin Luther or not.
Right.
Right. I'm not going to go into the theology side. It would be great to just have a class on Luther and the Reformation. Right. Just for people to grow deeper in their faith. Or Bonhoeffer is a great, there's been a lot of biographies, right? So Bonhoeffer would be another one where you have a great, or maybe it's a spiritual discipline class, right? On Lectio Divina or fasting or prayer or Bible reading or this or that. Any of these classes, these deepen classes that are just intended you can't cover it in a 30-minute sermon, right? You just have to have longer time and more interactive exercises to help people grow. That would be a great deepen next step. A deploy one would be all about how do you, what kind of experience or step or class would you have to release people into service? So maybe discovering their spiritual gifts, or strengths finder, or how do you best serve, or any of these things where you're just, maybe it's even a serve, right? A serve at a particular ministry across the city or international mission trip. That would be a great deploy next step. Right. So when you think about all of your next steps, just categorize them between deepen, discover, and deploy. Discover, deepen, and deploy. The first steps would be, I would, think about ABCs. So what are your actions? What are your biases? And what are your classes? So it's not really the same thing as discover, deepen, and deploy. It's more about how do you welcome and identify individuals into the life of your church. So what are the things that you do to welcome them? Is it an announcement from the stage? Is it in the bulletin? What are your actions that you are doing to welcome people into the life of your church, to recognize them? But then what are the biases in the way that you do things? Because that goes back to the self-awareness side of it. What are those biases? And then what class do you have? What experience do you have for your newcomers to come in? And the thing that I'm seeing a lot and helping a lot of churches with is, instead of having the once a month, hour and a half class that is in a specific room that people need to walk to, what if you had short 1, 2, 5, 10-minute experiences after each service that you direct newcomers to? Not going into a room, because that's threatening. That's like, oh, you're going to close the door behind me. I've committed to something. But what if it's an open, designated space for newcomers, that you're not even asking your newcomers from stage and on the Sunday morning to go to this class or to sign up for this thing or anything. You're just saying, hey, if you're brand new, hey, we want to meet you at this area outside of the lobby, or in the lobby, or at the back of the service, or this or that. And we just want to connect with you. And a lot of churches give a free gift, this, that, or the other. But instead of moving people into a class, you get them there, have that personal connection, connect with them, right? What are your actions? And then you can invite them into an experience where, oh, here's something that would be great here's a great next step, or maybe that in and of itself is a great 5-10 minute time where you can tell them the vision of the church and then help them get plugged in.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's excellent. I love that. I love how you kind of walk us through breaking down, because this also, leads right back to that self-assessment. If you're breaking down everything you're doing when it comes to helping people become more like Christ, right? And you're putting it on a whiteboard and you're categorizing and you're seeing, okay, what needs to stay, what needs to go all together, and then where do things fit, and how do we continue to help people understand this idea of the direction their life is moving, rather than, like you said, you go through all the courses and you get your diploma and, you get your transcript and you're bing mature, right? You're just like Jesus then. So we know the reality is it's ongoing for all of us. So that's super, super helpful. And that, tell us just real quickly, we don't have a ton of time left, but tell us real quickly, like some of the churches that you've worked with who've been able to move to this discipleship as direction. How has that impacted the church as a whole when it comes to revitalizing? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
For sure. So when it comes into the church, and it really gets into how do you plan your ministry, right? Because every church is on an annual basis should be evaluating what you've done and coming up with ideas as to, hey, what are we going to do this next year? Is it particular events or studies or this or that? So when it comes into the ministry planning cycle, what happens when you shift to a directional approach to discipleship, you actually begin looking at, okay, what are the ongoing steps and what are the things and what is first, what is next? So your entire ministry, the kids minister, the student pastor, the guest services person, worship, everyone is thinking about those categories and they're saying, what are we doing to help people move ultimately to the ongoing steps? Right. So even, for example, worship ministry, if the worship ministry, and this is a really common tension, right? It's like, are people in the worship band, is that a small group?
Right.
Is that a small group, or should they be in a separate small group? No, the thing is, it's not about getting into a small group, and it's not about the small group pastor considering every grouping of people a small group to try to up their numbers.
Right.
What it is are the worship team members in a regular environment where they belong, where they can grow, where they can be transparent, where there's that ongoing connection, right? Is there that aspect? And it's not about just playing, right? Can they be vulnerable? Can they be transparent? Are people challenging them? Are people speaking the gospel into their life, right? So there are these characteristics, there are these criteria that you have, but instead of looking at it from a black and white, no, but they're not in a small group that is doing this particular study, but you're actually looking at it from the perspective of values, then every ministry area can actually say, okay, well, here's how we are actually contributing to people moving into the ongoing steps and growing as a disciple of Christ. So, super practically, anyone leading or in a next step, even when you do the whole Bonhoeffer thing, for example, a win isn't numbers, right? Because this is the thing about a lot of churches. It's all about up and to the right? You want more people in classes, especially the more programmatic churches. They just want more. They want higher numbers this year than last year.
Right.
But the thing is, if let's say you're doing a class on Bonhoeffer or on the spiritual disciplines, the metric is not actually how many people went to that class. The goal and the metric should be how many people went through the material. So if you're really doing this well, you would take that spiritual disciplines material or the Bonhoeffer material, you would give that to all of your small groups. And you would say, hey guys, we are going to announce this as a church as a next step, a one-time event where we're going to be teaching this. But hey, if you want to do this in your group with your group, then here you go, or come as your group to that experience instead of meeting as a group that week. So what ends up happening, it's not about how many people attended, it's how many people went through, so that when you announce it from the stage, you're saying, hey everyone, if you're not plugged into a life group, if you've been coming here for a while and you're just you loved what we talked about today about the spiritual disciplines and you just want to go a little bit deeper, then we want to invite you to this one-time class. It's 2 hours long, or it's an hour and a half. We're going to have great coffee. It's going to be, offered on this time and this time. And we'd love for you to come. No strings attached. This is not for everyone. This is only for you. If you're a dad and you have been struggling with just getting connected because you don't have the time to get into a life group, right? And you're busy with work and then driving your kids to baseball and to this and that. we have designed this specifically for you. If you're a mom, right? So you see what I'm doing? I'm narrowing in who I want. Because when I narrow it in, and this goes into the entire concept around echo chambers that I write about as well. It's just, it's when you narrow it in, then people are going to be like, oh, that's me. Right, okay, right. I better go. Whereas a lot of times in church ministry, we ministry programming, announcements, everything, we just say this is for everyone because we want numbers to go up into the right. But actually that's not a success. So the big practical thing I'd say is just change your metrics, right? Evaluate your metrics.
That's good. And there's been so much conversation around metrics. I mean, and that'll be an ongoing conversation in the church world, I'm sure. And so I love the idea of reevaluating our metrics and stepping back and reflecting on them and trying to find out like what, because, we often say, what matters gets measured. And so we have to decide really what matters, when it comes down to metrics. So I love that. I love how this all kind of helps set the local church up on this kind of journey to growing deeper and to really engaging more with people along their journey with Jesus. So there are these entry points, and then there are these ways for people to grow and deepen, and it just provides really not so much a program, which we see so often, but it provides kind of this framework, for people to kind of step into and find, like you said, where do they fit into this, and then how do they take those next steps. So I think it's very, very healthy. It's awesome, brother. Well, man, I loved having you on. We could literally talk for hours.
It's true.
But I want to encourage people. We referenced your book, No Silver Bullets, multiple times. Again, it's a fantastic book. If someone wants to find that book, is there the best place that they can go, or do you have a place to recommend?
If you just look up No Silver Bullets, wherever books are sold, on Amazon, Lifeway, wherever, you can do that, and you'll see it.
Awesome.
It'll pop up. Yeah.
Perfect, brother. And then if people want to connect with you, if something they heard, they want to connect with you more directly, how can they do that?
Yeah, so DanielM.com. Last name is 2 letters, I-M. So DanielM.com. There you can find my links to social, Instagram, Twitter, all that stuff. And there I write, and that's probably the best way to connect. Perfect. DanielM.com, and then you can find my links there.
Awesome, and we'll have links in the show notes to all that great stuff. Daniel, I appreciate you, brother, and I appreciate all you're doing for the kingdom. And thank you for being with us on the Church Leaders Podcast.
Likewise. Thanks, Jason.
I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on this week's episode. Every week, as we are putting the episodes together, we're thinking of you, our pastors and ministry leaders, and striving to provide insightful and inspiring interviews as you seek to grow as a kingdom leader. So we hope you're finding value from the Church Leaders Podcast, and if so, we'd certainly appreciate you taking a few moments to head over to iTunes and leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders more easily find our podcasts, so they too can benefit from these interviews. Again, we thank you in advance, and if you have any comments, any questions, suggestions, or ideas for guests, I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com, or you can connect with me on Twitter. Finally, you can find this podcast as well as other great faith-based podcasts on the FaithPlay app. It's available for both Apple and Android, and so we encourage you to check that out as well. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.